Today on the podcast, I am diving into a bunch of recent books about Disney and theme parks that I've enjoyed, including The Ride of a Lifetime, the autobiography of Bob Iger, which interested me a lot more than I expected. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 87 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton, and this episode is all about books that I've been reading lately on Disney and theme parks in general. And I've been thinking about doing this type of show for a while, but what really sealed it for me was I was reading the book The Ride of a Lifetime by Bob Iger, and I found it so interesting and was surprised by just some of the stories from his background that I hadn't really considered in terms of his career and how that evolved. And I wanted to talk about that book. I feel like maybe I could do a whole podcast just on that book. And then I've read so many other interesting titles in the past few months that I thought it would be cool to just do a podcast where I talk about Bob Iger's book, but then also mention some other titles that I've read recently that I think you would really enjoy reading, whether they're focusing specifically on the Magic Kingdom or books about cleaning the parks, or even one of the co-founders of Pixar's book. There's a lot of interesting things. And at the end, I'm also going to talk about a podcast that I have really been enjoying, that if you are someone that wants to go beyond the official stories about Disney, you are definitely going to want to check out that current series on that podcast. So what I'm going to do is basically give you the basic premise of each book and then talk a lot about my reactions. Now, I am not a book critic. I am not looking at these from, was this the greatest book or terrible? If I have some concerns about something, there's a few here and there, I'll definitely mention them. But in general, I just want to explain how I reacted to these books, where maybe then it might be something that strikes your interest, and a book that maybe you had thought, oh, I'm not really interested in that hearing me talk about it will help you to then give it a shot and see what you think. There are so many books out there right now, whether through Theme Park Press, which is putting out a lot of books, through Disney's official books that are out there, and plenty of others. A lot of the old Imagineers or people that worked at the parks have written really interesting things. Some of them have talked to me here on this show, and I cannot catch up with all of them. I can't wait to read, for example, Chris Merritt's book about Mark Davis and Marty Sklar's latest book. I don't talk about either of those here, but those are on my list to read very soon. But this list, I feel like, is a good start in terms of some that have come out recently, some that are a bit older, but all of them have something to offer that I think you might enjoy. So let's dive in to my latest Disney book reads. All right, well, let us start with the big one. The Ride of a Lifetime, Lessons Learned from 15 Years as CEO of the Walt Disney Company by Robert Iger. I want to start by talking about something a bit different that relates. My favorite band of all time is Midnight Oil. They've been my favorite band since I picked up their album Blue Sky Mining in 1990, actually a cassette tape when I was 14 years old, and they've been my number one band ever since. So a few years ago, their singer, Peter Garrett, released this gigantic autobiography, and I was so pumped to read it. I was like, this is great. I read everything I can about this band. I cannot wait to read this book. Some of the information in the book about the band and how they started and how they grew and how they got popular was really interesting to me. It was cool. But you could sort of sense that Peter Garrett, not as interested in that. The band had broken up in 2002. He had been a politician in Australia for much of that time. Now they're playing again, but at the time when he wrote this book, they hadn't. And so you could sense he really wanted to talk about what it was like to be a politician. He wanted to settle a few scores and really explain his experience with something he felt really passionate about. The band was important, but the band was like 30%, half the story for him. And for me, I found that a little disappointing because what I was looking for in the book was a really detailed look at what it was like to be part of Midnight Oil for more than 25 years. The thing is, that doesn't mean that it's a bad book. That just means that I was looking for something different than what he was interested in writing. And I mention that not because I had the same experience with Bob Iger's book. One, I don't put Bob Iger on the same pedestal as I do the frontman of what I think is the greatest rock band of all time. I think of Bob Iger as a CEO that has made very good business moves, but doesn't really have a finger on the pulse of what's going on in the parks, and sometimes could seem a bit aloof given what cast members are making and such. That was the feeling I had going into reading this book. I thought he's made some brilliant business moves. He can speak well. He's not Bob Chapek. He's able to convey, he's a professional, and there are much worse people that could be the head of Disney. He's led the company to a bright future through Pixar, Star Wars, and Marvel. But I knew very little about him, really. I knew that he had become the CEO. Up to that point, he didn't mean anything to me, really. So what I was most interested in this book was finding out that. And I think he does give that information. I mentioned the story about Midnight Oil more because if you are going into this book wanting to know a lot about the theme parks and his philosophy of what he's doing with Walt Disney World and Disneyland and the expansion of the parks and things about intellectual property and attractions, all that, that's really not in this book at all. He does talk about Shanghai and how much that means to him. He does talk about anecdotes in terms of the parks and things opening and what they were doing, but his focus is not on the parks. So if you're going in expecting that, you're going to read this book and be like, I don't really care. Now, I know a lot of you are not just parks fans. You're also fans of Disney, you're fans of Marvel, Lucasfilm, movies in general, television, all of that. So I suspect there's still going to be a lot of things in this book that you're going to find interesting. For me, what I found most interesting is when we got beyond the facade, when we really learned more about him. I particularly found the first third of the book to be the most interesting because I didn't know about his background, just doing kind of odd jobs and whatever he could and dealing with real jerks in terms of the entertainment industry and ultimately moving up and working at ABC. I found all that really interesting because it gave me more background and it showed me that a person that seemed to be a bit of a robot actually does have heart. And yes, it's a very controlled book. This is not a 750-page, I'm going to mention everything that happened. I'm going to spend 200 pages on my family. This is not Bruce Springsteen's book where he's really digging in to his family history and how it's affected him in his life now. This is different. This is somebody who's looking to explain those things and talk about his past, but it's all done. He picks and chooses what he wants to talk about. But the good thing about that is it's a very easy read. This is not a book that you're going to get to page 200 and go, oh my gosh, or page 400. It's not even really going to get that far. It flows by. I think I read it in like less than a week. And I am not somebody now in my life who reads that many books that fast. I tend to take longer just because I'm often reading at like 10, 11 o'clock at night right before I go to bed, which ends up being I read 10 pages. When a book really grabs me, I find myself reading longer at night and then grabbing any few minutes I can find. And that was the case here. It's not a perfect book, but I found it a lot more interesting than I expected. And even going back to his time at ABC, I'm a big fan of the show Twin Peaks. And I found his description of, one, being a champion of that show, and two, then having issues with them not revealing who killed Laura Palmer, and then kind of battling with David Lynch, to be super interesting. You can look at that story in so many different ways. The way he explains it, I feel like is very even-handed, but I have seen people put out on Twitter, he makes a comment about maybe he was right, maybe David Lynch was wrong, but then does also admit that maybe he didn't handle it well. And that's something I do appreciate. Yes, it's pretty controlled. There are cases where Bob Iger talks about situations where he could have handled things better, like with George Lucas and with Star Wars. Bob talks about how they could have done a better job when they decided that they weren't going to use the story treatments that Lucas provided for The Force Awakens. And instead of presenting it, and he felt like he should have done a better job communicating that to George, and George was really hurt by it. And I think that is big that he even described that, because, it did come out that George Lucas was not a big fan of The Force Awakens because it seemed like a retread, which it is, though I think it's great. So that was interesting to me. Another thing that I really liked was all the information about Steve Jobs and his approach to trying to buy Pixar and repair that relationship. I find that Iger really has a soft spot and was a close friend by the end with Steve Jobs. And the story of Jobs basically setting him aside and telling him that he's sick right before the Pixar sale was about to go through and putting him in a real dilemma was very interesting. And of course, there's some information about Michael Eisner and how that worked. I also thought that while Iger didn't present a glowing portrait of Eisner, I'm sure Eisner would look at it completely differently, but I do feel like he was pretty fair this way too. He didn't really attack him. I think he presented that he was a mentor to him and had a lot of respect, but then the way that it ended, like everyone knows, was pretty ugly. And also some of his information about Roy Disney, I thought was interesting too, given his role in kind of the Disney war part of it. All of that is probably going to interest you. If you've read more about it, it might not seem like it's completely different information, but it's from a different perspective. So overall, I feel like this is worth reading if you're a Disney fan. Again, you're not going to find out something about the parks that is going to surprise you. For me, it's more about just getting a little bit of perspective and insight into where the current CEO of this massive company came from. It's written in a very down-to-earth way, and I think that's by design. I would say that I don't feel like it's described as lessons learned, and he does kind of talk about some of his leadership principles, but they're pretty vague. You have things like optimism and fairness and courage. I've read enough books about, leadership and about motivation that nothing in there for this really meant that much to me. And it's not that any of his points are bad. It's just that they're pretty straightforward. They're pretty typical. And so if you're going into this looking about ways to really learn something in terms of leadership, how to run a big company, how to grow in your career, yes, I think you can take some insight from what Iger did and decisions he made and how he handled himself. There's a lot there. But in terms of the lessons learned, I don't feel like there was that much on that end, but it didn't really take too much away from the book because, again, I didn't really approach this book as something where I'm going to learn a bunch from Bob Iger and then grow in my career. I thought, I want to know more about this guy, and I felt like I should read it. It might be interesting. But I still kind of went in with fairly low expectations. So the fact that there were stories in there from across his career that I thought were interesting was something that I appreciated, and it leads right up to the Fox acquisition. He talks about streaming, so it's very up to date. If you're trying, this is not a case where it ends 5 years ago or 3 years ago and he just had a slow time writing it. You can tell they updated it well up until the recent information, and so we don't have as much about that because it's near the end. And like I said, I found the most interesting part to be before he was CEO or around the time he was getting started, because he did have some struggles. And that's one last thing I want to mention. He talks about having an anxiety attack at one point when he was trying to become CEO. And the process to be approved for CEO sounds like a real dehumanizing process. And I know this is a situation where you say, well, Bob Iger is making a ton of money and CEO is a big position. And of course, Disney has to put him through a lot of things in order to get to that level of such an important job, which very few people have ever had. However, it does seem like, at least from his perspective, that they pushed it pretty far, and there were members of the board that went well beyond what they needed to do. Again, at least from what his view. And I found that part to be interesting, just to see, I am not anywhere near being the CEO of a large company, but I've gone through hiring processes that were not very smooth. And to see this at the very top level, where even with the stakes being so high and people that have really reached a huge high level in their career, that they're still kind of petty and seem a little odd and maybe not the best approach. It didn't shock me, but I found it interesting too, given that he had to fight through a lot to get where he is. And granted, he's been rewarded very handsomely in his life, but this stories still did resonate regardless of where I am in my career and obviously where he is. The next book I wanted to talk about is related to Bob Iger's autobiography, though it actually came out more than 5 years ago, which is Creativity, Inc., Overcoming the Unseen Forces That Stand in the Way of True Inspiration by Ed Catmull and Amy Wallis. Now, Ed Catmull is not a household name to everyone. He's not nearly as well known as the other co-founders of Pixar Animation Studios, Steve Jobs and John Lasseter. Obviously, those two have been a lot more front and center, and Ed is more the man behind the scenes. And Bob Iger does talk about meeting Ed Catmull in his book and how different he was from the more gregarious John Lasseter, and of course, from Steve Jobs, who are more front and center, the type of people that lead a presentation and try to rile up the troops and everything, whereas Catmull is more of the person behind the scenes working on the technology side of it and is a genius, as much as we can say, and played a huge role in, when you think about the names and what got Pixar going, you think of people like Brad Bird and Pete Docter and, of course, John Lasseter and so many others. And Ed Catmull's name should be right up there, if not before a lot in that group. And this book really solidified that for me. I admit I didn't know that much about him before I read this book. I picked this up to read when I was flying out to Walt Disney World in September, and I found it to be a really interesting read. And unlike Bob Iger's book, this one focuses more on creativity and on ideas to help you. Again, it's still focused on the story of Ed and especially the story of Pixar, but there's more to it in connecting it to how to be creative and the environment and the ideas that can make that happen. I have to mention that this book came out well before all the news about John Lasseter and the complaints against him and the what seems like a toxic environment that had built at Pixar that allowed John Lasseter to have free rein to do awful things. At least from what I can tell. I mean, I'm only reading the news stories and everything, but it seems pretty obvious I've read some personal narratives about this and about the situation there, especially for women. It sounds really bad. So this is written by one of the co-founders of Pixar and is mostly, understandably, a positive look at the Pixar culture. However, there are mentions in this book about issues and complaints about John Lasseter. Now, they don't go into the level that we ultimately found out, which led to him leaving Pixar and Disney. But it's still, if now knowing this and reading it from that perspective, I do find it interesting that even in a book like this, there still will be mentions of that. And actually, the descriptions of Lasseter's issues here seem kind of similar to what's in Bob Iger's book. You can criticize Iger for not really going into too much detail there, but I suspect that there may have been some legal hurdles in terms of what Iger could say and couldn't say, but that doesn't totally let him off the hook. If you didn't know at all the issues with John Lasseter, the book that Bob Iger wrote and the descriptions of him as a hugger and all that don't really explain what seemed to be the situation there. And so in both cases, you have to go in reading this book from Ed Catmull, understanding that there's probably more to this story. However, at least for me, I felt like I knew that, and I took that as a framework in that John Lasseter and overall at Pixar, there appeared to be some really big issues that needed to be resolved. And so with that as an understanding, I still feel like there are a lot of things that are worth reading here. I found a lot of the descriptions of how difficult it was to create Toy Story and just how many hours they worked and how everyone was just beaten down by it. It really gave me an appreciation for what they accomplished in terms of Toy Story and how Pixar, when now you almost think of Pixar as, oh, of course, Pixar was inevitable. They make great movies. They've been doing it for so long. There was a good chance that it never would come to be the way it is now. And then also, too, seeing the purchase of Pixar by Disney from this perspective prior to then reading the chapters from Bob Iger about it gives an interesting look where you have Ed Catmull's perspective as someone who's like, we need to retain our culture. We need to ensure that if Disney buys Pixar, that we're able to still act the way that we do. And of course, then what happened is Lasseter and Catmull ended up leading Disney Animation, which led to, you have hits that have come out in the last 5 to 10 years, like Tangled and Moana and Frozen, that all now, Disney Animation was not doing well for a good period of time when Pixar was thriving. And now you can see the impact of some of those leaders and that culture that then shifted over to how Disney Animation was run. And so I found a lot to like out of this book in terms of having a better appreciation for what Pixar has accomplished over the years, and especially given where they started and how they evolved into, you're seeing every step of the way from Ed Catmull, basically where they started as this small group of thinkers and creative people and where that eventually evolved to being just a huge force in animation. This book does an excellent job in going through each step of that, and even knowing that, John Lasseter is all over this book, but knowing where it eventually led, and makes me wonder sometimes when they talk about the great culture, if that was only for certain people that work there. He talks about the brain trust meetings and even them having issues and really having to grapple with them. And I found all that to be interesting too. And I would think now the situation at Disney Animation and at Pixar, with it being led, and this is nothing against Ed Catmull, but being led by a different team is really important. Well, you have someone like Jennifer Lee being so high there, where it was really a male-dominated group. I think that's super important. So it gives me hope, too, that things got better a bit. Ed Catmull ultimately left Disney in October of last year, and of course Lasseter left before that. And then you have Jennifer Lee now taking Lasseter's place in June 2018. And I feel like, in general, Disney Animation and Pixar also are in a really good place, but they never would have got to that point without the work of Ed Catmull and Lasseter building that. And I think this book does a good job of showing the hurdles they had to overcome and why they were able to be so successful. And it's a really interesting book if you want that background. And I think it complements Bob Iger's book very well, especially because they're covering some of the same issues. Both of them, I would not say you're getting any dirt or anything on anyone here, but they both do give insight and background and are pretty candid, especially this book. I feel like Ed Catmull is pretty candid about some of the challenges they faced, and it's definitely worth your time to check out this book. One other thing that I wanted to mention about Ed Catmull's book is that he takes really complicated technical information about how computer animated films are made and puts it in a way that's really accessible but not dumbed down. The way he describes even how Pixar functions He's a technical guy, and I'm sure this also helped that he wrote it with a co-author, in that finding a way to make this a compelling story, and that makes Creativity Inc. something you should really check out. I also mention that because it connects to my next book, which is The Thinking Fan's Guide to Walt Disney World, The Magic Kingdom for 2020, the new edition from Aaron Wallis. And Aaron does a great job in diving in to some intellectual ideas and concepts in terms of the Magic Kingdom and the attractions, but never making it seem too academic or too in the weeds in that way. It's still a fun book, and you can tell that he really loves the parks. So even when this book, which is an extensive look at all the attractions at the Magic Kingdom, taken from a perspective of someone that's looking beyond just what is the attraction, why is it cool, what are the highlights, what are the tips. This is not a trip planning book. This is not something like the unofficial guide that goes into such detail about the best way to do a Disney World trip. This is somebody who's been to the parks many times and is looking at the attractions in a much closer way, and sometimes in a way that I would not expect. I had Aaron on the podcast way back on episode 23, where we talked about his Thinking Fan's Guide to Epcot. And in that one, what I really appreciated is even when he was talking about things like putting Frozen at Epcot, he didn't take the most obvious route, like even I might take about, oh, we got to put intellectual property in there. He dug a lot deeper. And that's the case here, where he's tackling things like, for example, he talks about Splash Mountain and Song of the South, which again is in the news now, given one, the arrival of Disney Plus and Song of the South not being there, and two, a really good podcast series about it that I'll be talking about a bit later. The way that Aaron goes into it, it is concise in explaining why people have concerns with the film, but then also going into why Splash Mountain is still a great attraction. These can be mutually exclusive things. And that's just one example of many when he talks about the Hall of Presidents and what it's been like with the evolution of having presidents speak. It's a fair look at how things are and the controversy surrounding it, but also forward thinking. The best example is probably the look at Carousel Progress in terms of the father making a lot of demeaning comments towards women during the show. And Aaron has an interesting take on it where he describes why, understandably so, people could watch the show, especially if you don't know the history. And this goes back to the 1960s, and a lot of the show is pretty similar to the show that came out in 1964. If you just look at it on your own, visiting, you're like, what is the deal with this guy? His wife is doing so much work and he's making jokes and going to the soda fountain. What's the story? But then Aaron also takes an interesting look where he flips it around and looks at the attraction as, well, maybe it's a way to show how far we've come by the end. I don't know. I like the way that he kind of does a thought experiment in terms of the Carousel Progress and doesn't just, the easy way out is to say, well, it's from the past. It's a different time. It's showing a different time. But Aaron goes a lot deeper, and I appreciate that in terms of this book. I like when I interview people on this podcast that they don't have just the most straightforward answer. I want to know that there's a lot more to it. That's kind of when I started the podcast. It was like, I want to talk to authors and filmmakers and even former Imagineers and learn their story and learn stories that go well beyond what I would have expected. And that's why this book connects with me so much, where you read it and you think, really, this is where he's going with this? But the more you think about it, it all kind of makes sense. Like, for example, the Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, where he talks about the attraction and how at the end it ends on such a gloomy note. And I had never really thought of that, where basically you go by the final scene and you have Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs are partying and dancing in a scene that's not actually in the movie. And then you have the witch right outside, and it's this ominous thing where it's like, things may be great now, but it's going to be bad. And then you end, it's like, well, that was a happy attraction, but dark tidings are on the horizon. This is something, it's interesting. And I like that. I liked that different approach where you're thinking about it from a new perspective. I also appreciate that this book has 30 plus pages of notes. This is a pet peeve of mine with some books about Disney and history, where you'll read a book and you'll think that was really interesting. I want to read more about this subject. I wonder where the sources are for some of this information. And then there's nothing. And you think, that's weird. There aren't any sources that in the back. There's not a large selection of notes in that way. And it makes me wonder, and I think, should I question what I've read? Am I just to take the author's word for it that everything they're saying is true? The notes section in this book, The Thinking Fan's Guide to the Magic Kingdom, is extensive and goes into a lot more details about everything that you're reading in there. I really need to take more time and probably just read through all the notes now that I've read the entire book and dig even further. One other thing I want to mention, this is something that Aaron's done in each of his books, is that he has a watch this at the end of the attraction. So it's like a film or a TV show or something that connects to the attraction itself. I mentioned Seven Dwarfs Mine Train. His film that he recommends you watch is Something Wicked This Way Comes from 1983, which is a movie that freaked me out as a kid. I remember watching this. It's like, it's a Disney movie. And it's got Jason Robards and Jonathan Pryce. And Jonathan Pryce is really creepy as Mr. Dark. And that's just one example. You think, how does that connect to Seven Dwarfs Mine Train? But what I just said basically about how it ends in such a dark way, that sort of fits with that film and how Disney films often can be quite dark and quite scary, despite having that glowy sheen to them that we all know. Other good examples are like with the Tomorrowland Speedway, where he connects it to Freeway Phobia, which stars Goofy in a driver's ed film. And that's not something I would have thought maybe, the Magic Highway or something like that. That's what he would choose. So a lot of these are pretty inspired choices. Even he chose Glee, the TV show, to connect to the Little Mermaid attraction, which doesn't have a really direct good story. It's more just a collection of songs, which Aaron brings up. I'm talking about the Little Mermaid attraction, which is just a collection of familiar songs from the movie. And of course, you have a similar situation with Glee, where there was a story, and there were, especially in the early seasons when I was watching it more, there were powerful scenes. However, it still was mostly a collection of songs. So that's also an interesting connection there. So overall, I think that if you are someone that is kind of tired of hearing the same things over and over about attractions and why they're good and why they're not, this book will be for you. I also feel like there's never a case where Aaron just says, this attraction's terrible. He will talk about the fact that certain attractions are not the best, but I feel he still tries to dig further and find something better, and that's something that's really enjoyable in this book. All right, next up are two books that both focus on what it's like to clean up after guests at Disneyland and so much more. And they are both titled Cleaning the Kingdom by Ken Pellman and Lynn Barron. The first one is called Cleaning the Kingdom, Insider Tales of Keeping Walt's Dreams Spotless. This one was published in 2015. And both Ken and Lynn worked in custodial at Disneyland. And I'll admit that I know basically nothing about what it's like to work in jobs like that. And it makes me think back to when I had Rand Boyd on the show early this year about his book Elbow Grease and Pixie Dust, which went into his memories working in maintenance at Disneyland. And this is sort of like that, but to another scale. Ken and Lynn, this book is over 400 pages long. And I looked at it and went, oh my gosh, how could you write that much about cleaning the kingdom? And it's easy, actually. There's plenty of cases in this book where I thought they could have gone in more detail. I didn't feel like it was stretched out or it was too much information. They both do a really good job of answering the types of questions that I would have when I read a book about cleaning the kingdom, where I think, isn't it kind of gross? And there's a whole chapter about gross things in the parks, including one story that made me laugh out loud involving a lot of urine from an elephant, which I won't do it justice if I repeat it, but I also don't want to overstress. That's one chapter in this book that talks about gross things, including some descriptions of bathrooms that you can imagine. They've seen some things, I will say, but that's a very small portion of the whole book. I don't want to oversell that part of it. Most of the book it's written from a personal perspective of what it was like to work there and each step, and with a lot of details about backstage at Disneyland. And it really gives you a good feeling of how you would work there in custodial and what you did and what kind of makes them tick. I really enjoyed one chapter, which is all about essentially a particular day at Disneyland, starting with waking up at 4:45 in the morning and then going to the parking lot and finally getting to work and changing and then doing the job. It really also gave me more appreciation for what they do and how challenging it is, because Disneyland and Walt Disney World too are known for being really clean places, especially I feel like when I was a kid. That was always a thing my parents talked about how clean the parks were. And that's something to adults that obviously is a big deal, especially compared to amusement parks at the time when I went in the 80s and early 90s. And this book does a really good job giving that. And it's such an insider's book. That's the thing that I appreciate, because they kind of take for granted that we're Disney fans. So there aren't a lot of things where you go, oh yeah, of course, yeah, I know what that is. They really get into the details. I also like some of the stories about big events that happened there, whether it was the last day of certain attractions like the Skyway that they talk about, or even what happened on 9/11 and the day after. There's some cool information that goes beyond just the cleaning of the park, but more what it's like to work there and some of the experiences you're going to have. There's also a chapter about meeting some celebrities, including a story with Michael Jackson and one about Elizabeth Taylor and a bunch of others. So there's a lot of different information there that you might not expect to find. They also have several where they just go land by land and tell stories and give you some background about what it's like to work there. And they go into a lot of detail about cleaning restrooms, not just on the gross side, but also just on what's involved there. And if you think about it, I mean, again, like I said, when a book is 400 pages long, you think there's going to be a lot of repetition, but really there's not. I also found it interesting. There's an attraction called The Empire Strikes Back, which talked about some outsourcing and some other unfortunate moves that were done. But overall, this is a pretty positive book, looking at it from two people that obviously love the parks. I should mention that Ken and Lynn also do the Sweep Spot podcast, which has been a long-running podcast that's had a lot of great guests. I am jealous of some of the people they've talked with. I mean, Rolly Crump even did the foreword for this book, which is a great get and is always cool to read something from Rolly about his view of what this book's about. Now, I should mention the second book that I read from Ken and Lynn, which is the more recent book, which came out this year, called Cleaning the Kingdom, Night, Day, Past, and Present. Now, this book's a little bit shorter. It's still like 240 pages, but I found this to be interesting, but in a different way. While it's interesting as a complement to the other one. Like, my thought is, too, if you want to know what it's like to clean the kingdom and that day-to-day experience, and really kind of an anecdotal look from a variety of different areas, I think the original book is the one to get. However, if you already have that, or if you feel like you'd rather learn more about the history and the people that led custodial and how it's changed over the years, that's where I feel like Night, Day, Past, and Present is a better book in that way, because they work together well. This one is more, it goes into details. It's about the lives of the various people that were in charge of custodial, kind of the key figures in the history from the beginning and then moving forward. And they obviously did more legwork and interviews and such to put that together. And I found this book, both books are an easy read. I flew through this one, given that it was a bit shorter. I mean, if you take out the notes and acknowledgments and everything, it is less than 200 pages. So it's a pretty straightforward read. The funniest thing about this is one of the things I found most interesting in this book was a large series of photos just of restrooms where they talked about all the different restrooms in the parks. And while you would think, well, what's the big deal about that? That's a little strange. But again, it's those specific details, like I even mentioned in the first book, where you go, I never really thought that you just present where the restrooms are and the differences and which ones are nicer and which ones have some interesting features. That can be a good part of a book and be fun to see. So I enjoyed that as one of my favorite parts of the book. Now, there is probably more information in here than most people might think they want to know about custodial and cleaning and busing and the other groups at Disneyland. And I apologize that I am, even after reading this book, there's so much information. I am probably not using all the right terms. So sorry to Ken and Lynn there, what I'm saying here. But I just want to say that I think both books are worth reading, especially the first book that came out 4 years ago. But even the new book is has a lot of good history. And if you're someone that really likes to read history books or information about Disneyland that goes beyond the attractions and beyond kind of the standard histories, and I am one of those people, these books are going to totally be right up your alley. So the final book that I'm going to talk about is a bit different from some of the others. It's from Dustin Engels. It's called Around the Worlds in 80 Days, One Fan's Journey to Conquer Disney's Magic Kingdoms. And it's published by Theme Park Press. And one of the things that I really like about a lot of the books that Bob McLean, the editor, puts out is you find a lot of interesting personal stories, whether it's working at Epcot or working at the Animal Kingdom, or in this case, you have someone who decided to see all of the overseas parks, basically not just overseas, all of the Disney parks in the span of 80 days. And it's something that I've definitely thought about. When I think about my bucket list and what I'd like to see, the big ones up there are Shanghai Disneyland, Tokyo Disney Sea, Tokyo Disneyland, and sure, Hong Kong, so that I could see Mystic Manor and a few other things there. And Dustin does it all, and he writes about it in this book. And something that I really enjoy is when I haven't gone to a park, whether it's through a podcast or a blog, getting that trip report about these overseas parks, and people that are really good at it know how to talk through not only what attractions they liked and didn't like, but what the experience is like actually being in those parks. That's such a big part of it because, in a sense, we want to know what it's like and also live vicariously through it. And I think that's definitely the case with this book, which is a lot of fun from Dustin. And it's a personal narrative, and I like the way that he's not too formal about the whole thing. Like, for example, in the Disneyland chapter up front, he talks about his concerns, or not even concerns, but more his feelings about traveling solo at the parks. And as someone who just took a solo trip to Disney World and had similar feelings, I could really identify with that because I felt like even his story of sitting at the table and then sitting with two people who kind of were very confused about him going on this trip around the world. And while I'm not doing a trip on that level, I can understand traveling solo and people kind of being like, what? What are you doing? Not people in this fan community, more a little bit beyond that. And so that's an interesting story up front. And it kind of colors how he describes what he's doing. I loved his story even in Shanghai, where he has a hard time finding a cab driver that could get him to the right place and then ends up driving in circles a lot just to get to his resort near Shanghai Disneyland. And experiences like that. So that's what I enjoyed about this book, which is it's more than just what it's like to go to the parks. Also, in Hong Kong, he talks about, one, how dead it is, but two, just he bought a 2-day ticket and then finished everything before dinner on the first day because there were no lines at all. And that park is really not that big. And then just kind of appreciating it and writing Small World over and over and not taking it so seriously. And that's something that I would love to see, but I know Hong Kong is such an odd park. But just in general, I found that stories like this, where as a fan, we want to do these things. We have, I have kids. We're going to go on family vacations. But of course you have this thought like, wouldn't it be great if somehow, without disrupting anything at home, I could just go? And granted, it's more fun when you go with your family. It's a blast. But there's still that thought of, what would that be like to really hit all the parks? And that's what kind of comes out in this book, which is, a little over 200 pages, but he has chapters for essentially all the parks, starting off with Disneyland and DCA, going through all the parks in Asia, then Walt Disney World, and then finishing off in Paris. And of course, it's always fun to hear what people think of the Walt Disney Studios, which I did go to Paris in 2006, and I found that park, oh my. And we were there before Ratatouille and Crush's Coaster, so it was even not a great thing. But I enjoy, too, just when Dustin in this book talks about things that he didn't like or things that surprised him. But he has a pretty open mind about a lot of things in terms of his anticipation for the park. Like he talks about Mission Breakout and how he went in kind of being upset that Tower of Terror had been closed and then found that it's just a blast of a ride, which is something that I've heard pretty much universally. I'm going to get to check it out in a few months. And so that type of experience for him happens over and over. And I just enjoy having this personal narrative that we can learn from, and also just an interesting story. That's pretty crazy to go to all these parks in such a small amount of time. You're not doing it I think doing all that in a year would be a challenge, but doing all of them, that'd be something. I think about, there was a clip that Disney Parks had from a few years ago about this guy that before Shanghai that did all the parks in the span of 80 hours or something crazy. I think it was 70 hours or something like that. And just did an attraction or two each one. I was like, that sounds terrible, because essentially you're not getting, it wasn't like he was spending a full day at each park or getting to really know about it. And I suspect this guy was someone who had been to the parks a lot. But compared to that, I appreciate the fact that, yes, he's doing a lot in 80 days, but Dustin still has enough time to be able to appreciate it, especially, in places like Hong Kong where there's no crowds, but gets to enjoy it. And he makes some mistakes along the way in terms of just wearing clothes for the right weather, or just how to deal with crowds, or ordering food, or navigating, so it's almost like a travel narrative about being in a country you're not that familiar with. So it goes beyond just the parks itself. So that made it a lot of fun to read. And it's something that if you're someone like me that likes to read trip reports and hear about places you haven't been, I think you should check it out. So before I finish, I wanted to talk about a podcast series that's going on right now. It's part of the long-running show You Must Remember This, hosted by Karina Longworth. I've been a fan of that show for a really long time. What I like about it so much is how much research goes into it, the production values, and just having this really interesting insight into areas of old Hollywood where I thought I knew the story, or sometimes didn't know the story at all. And it's done in such an entertaining way to really dig at both what made Hollywood great, but also the hypocrisy and a lot of the things going on in the background that aren't part of the legend. And there's been a bunch of seasons over the years, including Hollywood during the war. There was one about the Manson family, another one about fake news in Hollywood. So many cool seasons. And I was excited to learn that Karina Longworth is now tackling Song of the South. Up to this point, she's released 4 episodes of her show. And each one has, the first one dug into an overview of the film, and then she talked about Hattie McDaniel, and then Zippity Doodah and how that connected to minstrel shows. And then the most recent is about white allies, particularly the communists that Walt Disney worked with in order to try to essentially combat any criticism he was going to receive from the film. Now, this could be tricky for some of you that really don't like to learn possibly negative or even controversial things about Disney's past. And I don't mean that in a bad way to you. I understand it. So many of us love the parks, love the films, enjoy what Disney has brought and what they're currently bringing. So a podcast series that goes into a film that Disney, despite having Disney Plus and so much out there, has no interest in releasing, may not be up your alley. However, if you're someone like me that enjoys learning even things that aren't so great about what Disney was doing and the history around it, you're going to find this fascinating, because I know I also read the book by Jim Korkis, and this takes a different approach where I feel like coming at it from more of an outsider, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean Karina, she's for a long time was a film critic. She's written a lot of books about George Lucas and Meryl Streep. She recently wrote one about Howard Hughes. I've been familiar with her work for a while, going back to the Spout blog, which also had a podcast that we're talking the late 2000s at that point, I believe, and have been a fan of her work and don't find that she's being overly harsh here. I think it's pretty fair, but really digging into the question, which I've heard people recently bring up on social media, why is Song of the South such a firestorm of a film? It's not just about the film itself. The film itself has some serious issues. It's been a little while since I've seen it. I actually am now more curious to watch it again, just with having so much background. The episode in particular about Hattie McDaniel and what she had to go through in her career, and then ultimately being a star and winning an Oscar for Gone with the Wind, and then what happened with her career after that, is really interesting and something that I knew very little about her at all. And I found that each episode sort of builds on the one before it and gives you a pretty complete picture, not only of Song of the South, the film, but of the issues surrounding it and the culture in general in the 1940s for Disney, and just overall. There's just a lot there. And that's why I highly recommend this show. One, it is produced on a professional level. It is not a situation where it's thrown together. There is a ton of background that goes into putting together the episodes, and I don't feel like it's overly unfair either. I think it just expands my interest in history, and I love the fact that Karina is going into this corner of Disney that a lot of us are curious about, but may not know that much about. I'll admit that I thought I knew a lot, but each episode unveils so much more that I didn't know. So I'd highly recommend it. If you'd like to learn more, of course, you can search for You Must Remember This on Apple Podcast or whichever podcast vendor that you use, or you can go to youmustrememberthispodcast.com. And I would also suggest, if you enjoy these episodes, there are years of past episodes that are worth checking out. And it's one of those cases where you can go and just kind of pick and choose the topics that interest you rather than having to stick through the whole thing. It's definitely worth your time to give the series on Song of the South a shot. I also wanted to mention that I did watch episode 1 of the Imagineering story on Disney Plus, and wow, it's incredible. I wrote a blog post about it that went up this past Friday, and I know episode 2 was also released on Friday, and I cannot wait to see that, and I'll be writing about that too at tomorrowsociety.com. What I loved about the first episode, one, there were a lot of the beats we expected, where we go through the origins of Disneyland, Black Sunday, the 64 World's Fair, a lot of the attractions, but there is so much good archival footage that's clear, and you have just some odd moments like the shot of the pirates on the back of a pickup truck, the animatronics being taken down the highway. There's some really great interviews, including recent ones, even with Marty Sklar, and then with Imagineers like Tony Baxter and Eddie Sato and Tom K. Morris and Glenn Barker, who are both on this show, plus some vintage footage of Harper Goff and Herb Ryman and so many others. If you are at all interested in Imagineering and the parks, which if you're listening to this, you probably are, and you have Disney Plus, it should be at the top of your list. It's an ongoing show called The Imagineering Story, and I cannot wait to watch the future episodes. The first episode is wonderful. Also, of course, had Bob Gurr and Rolly Crump, and there is a scene with Bob Gurr inside the Matterhorn that really special, something special that you're not going to see on your typical promotional documentary. So you should definitely check that out too. If you enjoyed this podcast, I'd highly suggest you check out episode 41, where I rank my top 5 books for Epcot fans. You can find that and a lot more at tomorrowsociety.com. Should also mention this podcast is a listener-supported show. If you'd like to help out, there's a really cool way to do so. You can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon. You leave a small monthly contribution. You get some really cool perks, including extra podcasts, an official pin and membership card, and a lot more. And you can learn more by going to tomorrowsociety.com/member. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at dan@tomorrowsociety. Follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music is written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking to former Disney Imagineer Mark Rhodes about his 25 years working for Disney, including his work on Maelstrom and Splash Mountain and so much more. That podcast will be here next week. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk to you again very soon.